"You don't belong here." The words slithered through the first-class cabin, sharp as a knife. Malcolm Hayes froze, his fingers tightening around the armrest of his $10,000 seat. The flight attendant's smile never wavered as she handed the white businessman beside him a steaming filet mignon, then turned to Malcolm with empty hands. "We've run out of first-class meals, sir. You'll have to wait for economy service." A lie. He'd counted the meals. But this wasn't about food. It was about power. And by the time this plane landed, every single person on board would learn what happened when you underestimated a man who'd spent his life being told he didn't belong. Something will happen next in this story that you would have never imagined. From which country are you enjoying this story? Let us know in the comments, and subscribe now, because this revenge thriller is just getting started.
The first-class cabin hummed with the quiet efficiency of money at work. The leather seats were wide enough to feel indulgent but not quite private, the kind of space that encouraged passengers to pretend they weren't all breathing the same recycled air. Malcolm Hayes settled into 3A, his tailored gray suit blending into the upholstery. At 36, he'd built Stratagen Technologies from a dorm room idea into a company that made billion-dollar corporations nervous. He could afford private jets now, but there was something deliberate about still flying commercial, about sitting among people who would never suspect the black man in the window seat owned more of their world than they realized. The man who took 3B smelled like expensive cologne and old money. Late 50s, salt and pepper haircut to look casually perfect. The kind of watch that didn't need to be flashy because everyone who mattered would recognize it. He glanced at Malcolm, did that quick up-and-down assessment Malcolm had come to expect, then opened his Wall Street Journal with a crisp snap of paper. "Champagne, Mr. Roth?" The flight attendant appeared at their row, her smile practiced and polished. "Thank you, Emily," the man said, accepting the flute with a nod. She turned to Malcolm, her expression not changing exactly, but something shifting behind her eyes. "And for you, sir?" "The same." A pause. Just a fraction too long. Then, "May I see your boarding pass?" Malcolm didn't react. He'd been through security, boarded with the other first-class passengers, was sitting in a first-class seat with his name printed on the ticket. And yet here it was. The quiet question that had followed him from the Bronx to every boardroom he'd ever walked into. "Prove you belong here." He handed her the pass. Emily scanned it, her cheeks coloring slightly as she confirmed his seat assignment. "My apologies, Mr. Hayes. Champagne coming right up." Roth turned a page of his newspaper without looking up, but Malcolm saw the way his jaw tightened. The silence between them grew teeth. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Malcolm stared out the window at the tarmac lights stretching into the distance. The memory surfaced without warning, sharp as broken glass. 15 years earlier. The bell above Mr. Chang's electronics store jingled when 15-year-old Malcolm pushed open the door. The smell of new electronics, that crisp plastic and ozone scent, hit him like possibility. He'd spent every afternoon for months at the Bronx Public Library, teaching himself to code on their ancient computers, poring over hardware manuals until his eyes burned and his stomach growled with missed dinners. Mr. Chang looked up from behind the counter. His expression shifted when he saw Malcolm, the welcoming smile freezing into something more guarded. "Can I help you?" The question sounded like, "What are you doing here?" Malcolm straightened his second-hand button down. "I was wondering if you're hiring. I know computers. I could help customers, build systems, whatever you need." Mr. Chang's laugh was short and humorless. "We don't need help right now." The door chimed again. A white kid Malcolm recognized from school walked in, his polo shirt crisp and new, his hair neatly combed. "Hey, Mr. Chang. My dad said to ask you about that summer job." Mr. Chang's face transformed. "Billy. Yes, we were just talking about that. When can you start?" Malcolm stood rooted to the stained carpet as they discussed hours and pay right in front of him. The message couldn't have been clearer if they'd spelled it out in neon. The job existed. Just not for him. He walked out, the bell jingling behind him like laughter at a joke he wasn't in on. Back in first class. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Emily began preparing the meal service, her movements efficient and graceful. Malcolm watched as she served Roth first, filet mignon so tender it barely needed a knife, truffle mashed potatoes, a glass of Bordeaux that probably cost more than Malcolm's first apartment. When she reached his row, her smile didn't waver, but something in her posture stiffened. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes, but we've run out of the first-class meals. I can bring you something from economy." Malcolm's fingers curled around the armrest. He'd counted the meals as she prepared the cart. There were at least 4 left, maybe more. Next to him, Roth made a quiet sound. Not quite a laugh, but close enough. "That's fine," Malcolm said, his voice perfectly calm even as his pulse roared in his ears. The plastic-wrapped turkey sandwich Emily brought him 10 minutes later sat untouched on his tray table, the condensation from the cheap bread making the wrapper stick to his fingers. The landing. As the plane began its descent into New York, Malcolm opened his laptop. His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up Atlantic Global Airlines financials. Stratagen had been their largest corporate client for 3 years running. $47 million in annual contracts, not counting the subsidiaries. He drafted an email to his CFO. Asterisk effective immediately. Cancel all contracts with Atlantic Global. Freeze all outstanding payments. Have legal draft termination notices citing breach of our diversity and inclusion clauses. Asterisk. He paused, then added. Asterisk pull our investments from Roth Capital Management. Full liquidation. Asterisk. Malcolm glanced at the man beside him, now dozing with his mouth slightly open, completely unaware that his hedge fund was about to collapse before breakfast. When the plane landed, Emily stood at the door, her professional smile firmly back in place. "Thank you for flying with us, Mr. Hayes." Malcolm met her eyes. The pleasure was all mine. His driver was waiting at the curb, the black town car idling. "Straight to the office, sir?" "No," Malcolm said, sliding into the back seat. "First, we're making a stop at Mr. Chang's Electronics." The past had waited long enough. The electronics store looked smaller than Malcolm remembered. The sign that had once seemed so imposing now appeared faded, the letters in Chang's Electronics, slightly crooked where the adhesive had begun to fail. The same bell jingled when he pushed open the door, but the smell was different, less like new technology and more like dust and desperation. Mr. Chang looked up from behind the counter, his face more lined than Malcolm remembered, his hair gone fully gray. The recognition was instant, though Malcolm saw the exact moment when the older man placed him, the tightening around his eyes, the slight stiffening of his shoulders. "Can I help you?" The same words. 17 years later. Malcolm let his gaze wander over the nearly empty shelves, the outdated laptops gathering dust in their display cases. Business seemed slow. Mr. Chang's jaw worked. "We manage." "I'm sure you do." Malcolm pulled a business card from his pocket and slid it across the counter. "But I think we can help each other." Mr. Chang looked down at the card, his face going slack as he read the Stratagen logo, Malcolm's name embossed beneath the title CEO. When he looked up, his expression was a mix of disbelief and something darker, the dawning realization that the boy he'd turned away was now a man who could buy and sell his struggling store without blinking. "What do you want?" Mr. Chang asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm smiled. "I think you know." Outside, his driver leaned against the town car, watching through the glass storefront as Malcolm began to settle an old score. Meanwhile, across town, Atlantic Global Airline CEO was just receiving the email that would send his entire executive team into panic mode. And in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, Daniel Roth was about to get a very unpleasant wake-up call from his investors. The morning sun slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Malcolm's corner office, casting long shadows across the financial reports spread across his desk. The numbers told a satisfying story. Atlantic Global stock had dropped 12% in pre-market trading after Stratagen's contract termination became public. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Hayes, Ms. Carter is here to see you." Malcolm didn't look up from the documents. "Send her in." The door opened with a soft click. Emily Carter stood in the doorway, her airline uniform replaced by a simple black dress, her hands clutching a small purse like a life preserver. Without the polished veneer of her flight attendant persona, she looked younger, more vulnerable. "You wanted to see me?" Her voice wavered slightly. Malcolm gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit." She perched on the edge of the seat, her back rigid. The office seemed to dwarf her. The soaring ceilings, the panoramic views of Manhattan, the silent power radiating from the man behind the desk. "I imagine you're wondering why I asked you here," Malcolm said, finally looking up. Emily swallowed hard. "I assume it's about what happened on the flight." "Partly." Malcolm leaned back in his chair. "Tell me, Emily, how long have you worked for Atlantic Global?" 12 years. "And in all that time, how often have you run out of first-class meals for certain passengers?" The color drained from her face. "I don't." "Let me rephrase." Malcolm's voice remained calm, almost conversational. "How many black passengers? How many women traveling alone? How many people who didn't fit whatever image your supervisors preferred for first class?" Emily's hands trembled in her lap. "It wasn't personal." Malcolm's smile didn't reach his eyes. "It never is." He opened a folder on his desk, revealing a stack of printed emails and complaint forms. "Do you know what's interesting? This wasn't your first incident. Just the first time you did it to someone who could fight back." Emily's breath came faster now. "What do you want from me?" "The truth." Malcolm closed the folder with a snap. "Not the polished version you tell HR. Not the excuses you make to yourself at night. The real reason you looked at me and decided I didn't deserve the same service as the man sitting next to me." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. "Gregory, my supervisor, he made it clear how things worked. Certain passengers got priority. It wasn't official policy, but you followed along," Malcolm finished for her. "Because it was easier than making waves." She nodded miserably. Malcolm studied her for a long moment. Then he slid a business card across the desk. "I'm starting a diversity initiative at StraightaGen. We need someone with first-hand experience of how systemic discrimination operates in corporate environments." Emily stared at the card, uncomprehending. "You're offering me a job?" "An opportunity," Malcolm corrected, "to do better. If you're willing to testify about Atlantic Global's practices, we'll make sure you're protected." Outside, the city hummed with its usual relentless energy. Somewhere downtown, Atlantic Global's lawyers were scrambling to contain the damage. In a luxury high-rise, Daniel Roth was fielding calls from furious investors. And in a modest electronics store in the Bronx, Mr. Chong was realizing that some debts couldn't be paid with money alone. The rain fell in sheets as Malcolm stepped out of the town car, the cold November wind cutting through his overcoat. The electronics store looked even more forlorn in the gray afternoon light, the flickering neon sign casting erratic shadows across the wet pavement. The bell jingled as he entered. Mr. Chong stood behind the counter, his shoulders hunched, his face drawn. The shelves were half empty now, the display cases gathering dust. "You came back," Mr. Chong said, his voice flat. Malcolm shook the rain from his coat. "I told you I would." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope, setting it on the counter between them. Mr. Chong didn't touch it. "What's this?" "An offer," Malcolm said. "To buy your store. Market value plus 20%. Mr. Chang's hands clenched into fists. "Is this some kind of revenge?" "No." Malcolm met his gaze. "It's a choice. You can take the money and retire. Or you can stay and watch your business die a little more each day." The older man's breath came in short, angry bursts. "You think you can just walk in here after all these years and—" "I think," Malcolm interrupted calmly, "that you made a choice 17 years ago. Now it's my turn." Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm wailed briefly before being silenced. Mr. Chong reached for the envelope with trembling hands. As he opened it, his eyes scanned the figures, the terms, the generous buyout clause that would ensure he never had to work again. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "Why?" Malcolm turned toward the door. "Because everyone deserves a chance to start over." The bell jingled as he stepped back into the rain, leaving the past behind him at last. The conference room at StraightaGen headquarters hummed with tension. Malcolm stood at the head of the long glass table, watching as the executives from Atlantic Global Airlines filed in, their tailored suits and forced smiles unable to mask their unease. CEO Robert Kensington took the seat directly across from Malcolm, his silver hair perfectly styled, his Rolex glinting under the recessed lighting. "Malcolm," Kensington began, his voice oozing practiced charm, "I want to personally apologize for any misunderstanding on Flight 214. We value our relationship with StraightaGen tremendously." Malcolm didn't sit. He placed his palms flat on the table and leaned forward. Let's be clear, Robert. There was no misunderstanding. Your employee deliberately denied me service based on the color of my skin. And she did it because your corporate culture allows, perhaps even encourages, such behavior. Kensington's smile faltered. Across the table, Atlantic Global's general counsel whispered urgently in the CEO's ear. What would it take to make this right? Kensington asked, spreading his hands. Malcolm tapped the tablet in front of him. A series of documents appeared on the wall-mounted screens around the room. These are sworn statements from 17 former and current Atlantic Global employees detailing discriminatory practices. This, he swiped to another document, is a class action lawsuit ready to be filed in federal court. And this, the screen changed again, is my offer. The room went still as executives leaned forward to read the terms. 1. Immediate termination of Gregory Hargrove and all supervisory staff involved in the incident. 2. A complete overhaul of diversity training programs, overseen by StrataGen. 3. Atlantic Global would sell Malcolm a controlling stake in the airline at a 30% discount. Kensington's face turned an alarming shade of red. This is extortion. No, Malcolm corrected calmly. This is capitalism. You made a business decision to tolerate discrimination. I'm making a business decision to hold you accountable. He turned toward the door, then paused. You have 48 hours to decide. After that, the lawsuit goes public and I start buying up your shares on the open market. As Malcolm exited, he didn't need to look back to know the room had erupted into panicked arguments. His phone buzzed with a text from his driver. Mr. Chong accepted your offer. The private elevator to Malcolm's penthouse was silent except for the soft hum of machinery. He loosened his tie as the doors opened, stepping into the spacious living area where floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the glittering Manhattan skyline. The woman sitting on his sofa turned as he entered. Long day. Malcolm smiled for what felt like the first time in weeks. You have no idea, Naomi. His younger sister set aside her laptop and stood, her resemblance to Malcolm evident in the sharp cheekbones and intelligent eyes. Unlike her brother, she'd chosen academia over business. A sociology professor at Columbia studying systemic inequality. I saw the news, she said, handing him a tumbler of bourbon. Atlantic Global stock is in freefall. Malcolm took a long sip, letting the warmth spread through his chest. Just the beginning. Naomi studied him. When does it stop, Malcolm? The electronics store, the airline, Roth's hedge fund. How many scores are you planning to settle? It's not about settling scores. He set down his glass with a sharp click. It's about proving that actions have consequences. That the system can work both ways. Naomi shook her head. You're becoming what you hate. A powerful man crushing people beneath him. The words landed like a physical blow. Malcolm turned to the window, watching the lights of the city blur through the rain-streaked glass. That's not what this is. Isn't it? Naomi picked up her laptop and showed him the screen. A news article about Mr. Chang's store closing, the old man's face etched with defeat. You destroyed him, Malcolm. Just like they tried to destroy you. The elevator dinged, signaling another arrival. Malcolm didn't turn as Naomi gathered her things. Think about what you're becoming, she said softly before the doors closed behind her. Alone in the penthouse, Malcolm stared at his reflection in the dark glass. A successful man in a tailored suit, standing atop a city that had tried so hard to keep him down. The question lingered in the silent room. When you tear down the system, what do you become in its place? The Atlantic Global boardroom was packed when Malcolm arrived the next morning. Reporters clustered outside the building, their cameras trained on the entrance. Inside, Robert Kensington sat slumped at the head of the table, looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. We accept your terms, he said without preamble, sliding a signed agreement across the table. Malcolm didn't touch the documents. Not anymore. A murmur ran through the room. Kensington's head snapped up. What? New terms. Malcolm placed his own folder on the table. You'll resign immediately. The entire executive team will be replaced. And Atlantic Global will implement the most aggressive diversity initiative in airline history, with my sister Naomi as its director. Kensington's mouth worked soundlessly. You can't. I can. Malcolm finally took his seat. Because as of this morning, I own 38% of your company's shares." As the board members erupted into shouts, Malcolm's phone buzzed. A text from Emily Carter, "I'll testify. And I'll take the job." Outside, the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the tarmac where Atlantic Global's plane sat waiting. Somewhere below, a new day was dawning. For the airline, for Malcolm, and for every person who'd ever been made to feel they didn't belong. The revolution, Malcolm realized, wouldn't be televised. It would be boarded at Gate B12, with priority seating for all. The Atlantic Global employee cafeteria buzzed with nervous energy on Malcolm's first day as majority shareholder. Workers clustered in small groups, their whispers following him as he walked through the space in a simple black suit. No entourage, no fanfare. The smell of stale coffee and industrial cleaner hung in the air, mixing with the faint metallic tang of fear. Every eye tracked his movement, waiting to see which table he'd choose, who he'd speak to first. Malcolm took his tray to where a group of baggage handlers sat, their high-visibility vests hanging loose over broad shoulders. They fell silent as he approached. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. The largest of the men, early 40s, with a scar running through his close-cropped beard, studied Malcolm for a long moment before nodding to an empty chair. "Suit yourself, boss." The plastic chair creaked under Malcolm's weight as he sat. He unwrapped his sandwich, the same dry turkey on cheap bread they serve in economy, and took a deliberate bite. Around him, the baggage handlers exchanged glances. "You're really eating that?" asked a younger handler with a gold tooth. Malcolm took another bite before answering. "Tastes better than I remember." A ripple of laughter moved through the group, the tension easing slightly. The bearded man, Marcus, his name tag read, leaned forward. "So what's the play here? You gonna fire half of us? Bring in your own people." "I'm bringing in my sister," Malcolm said, wiping his hands. "Naomi Hayes. She starts Monday as head of the new diversity initiative." Marcus snorted. "Another corporate training program? We've done those. They don't change shit. This one will." Malcolm held Marcus's gaze. "Because you're going to help design it." The table went quiet again. Outside the cafeteria windows, a plane taxied toward the runway, its engines a distant roar. Naomi's Columbia office smelled like old books and lavender tea. She looked up from her laptop when Malcolm entered, her expression unreadable. The morning light caught the silver streaks in her braids, the lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when they were kids sharing a bedroom in the Bronx. "You're late," she said. Malcolm took the chair across from her desk, noting the stack of employee files already spread across its surface. "You've been researching, trying to understand what I'm walking into." She tapped a file. Marcus Johnson, 12 years with Atlantic Global, 3 disciplinary write-ups, all for insubordination, after reporting safety violations. "Sound familiar?" Malcolm smiled faintly. "He's good people." Naomi closed the file with a sigh. "You realize this initiative won't work if it's just window dressing, right? Real change means overhauling hiring practices, promotion criteria, the entire corporate culture." "I know." Malcolm leaned forward. "That's why I need you. Not as a figurehead, as a bulldozer." Outside, students crossed the quad, their laughter floating through the open window. Naomi stared at them for a long moment before turning back. "One condition," she said. "We start with the flight attendants union. If we're going to change anything, we need their buy-in." Malcolm nodded. "Done." The union meeting took place in a cramped hotel ballroom that smelled of old carpet and burnt coffee. Malcolm stood at the back as Naomi addressed the crowd of mostly women in Atlantic Global uniforms, their faces ranging from curious to openly hostile. Emily Carter sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When Naomi called her up to share her experience, the room erupted. "You're the one who started all this," shouted a red-faced attendant near the stage. "Now we're all gonna lose our jobs." Emily flinched but stood her ground. "I made a mistake. But the problem wasn't just me. It's the whole system. The unspoken rules about who deserves what." Marcus, who'd come at Malcolm's invitation, stood from his seat near the aisle. "She's right. You think baggage handlers don't see how certain passengers get treated? How certain employees get promoted?" The room dissolved into overlapping arguments. Naomi let it go on for a full minute before stepping back to the microphone. "This is the choice," she said, cutting through the noise. "We can keep pretending nothing's wrong while the company bleeds money and jobs. Or we can be the ones to fix it." A heavy silence fell. In the back, Malcolm watched as hands slowly began to rise in tentative agreement. The process would be messy, painful even. But for the first time since he'd bought the airline, it felt like real change might actually be possible. The storm hit just as Malcolm's town car pulled up to Mr. Chang's old electronics store. Rain sheeted against the pavement, turning the gutters into rushing streams. Inside, workers were clearing out the last of the inventory, the shelves now bare skeletons of what they'd once been. Mr. Chang stood by the register, watching as two men loaded a display case onto a dolly. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders stooped under a worn cardigan. When he saw Malcolm, his expression hardened. "Come to gloat?" he asked. Malcolm shook rainwater from his coat. "Come to make an offer." He handed Mr. Chang a business card, not his own, but Naomi's. "My sister's department at Columbia is looking for an adjunct professor, someone who can teach the practical side of running a small business." Mr. Chang's hands trembled slightly as he took the card. "Why would you do this?" "Because everyone deserves a second chance," Malcolm said. "Even me." Outside, the rain slowed to a gentle patter. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled its retreat. Mr. Chang stared at the card for a long moment before slipping it into his pocket. "I'll think about it," he said, but the words carried less edge than before. Back at his penthouse, Malcolm stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows watching the city lights flicker to life as night fell. His phone buzzed, a text from Naomi. "Union voted yes. We start Monday." He smiled and set the phone aside. The road ahead would be long, filled with setbacks and resistance. But for the first time in years, Malcolm Hayes felt something he'd almost forgotten. Oh! The Atlantic Global headquarters atrium echoed with the sound of dress shoes on marble as Malcolm walked toward the bank of elevators. Employees parted before him like a school of fish avoiding a shark, their whispered conversations cutting off abruptly as he passed. The scent of fresh paint and new carpet couldn't quite mask the underlying tension in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. The elevator doors slid open to reveal Naomi already inside, reviewing documents on a tablet. She didn't look up as Malcolm stepped in beside her. "You're late." "Union negotiations ran long," Malcolm said, pressing the button for the executive floor. Naomi finally glanced at him, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "You look like hell." He rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Haven't slept." The elevator began its ascent, the digital display ticking off floor numbers in silent increments. Naomi returned to her tablet. "The board is nervous. Kensington's old guard has been whispering in their ears all week." Malcolm adjusted his cuffs. "Let them whisper." The doors opened onto a corridor lined with framed photos of Atlantic Global's history. Black and white images of propeller planes giving way to modern jets. At the end of the hall, the boardroom doors stood slightly ajar, the murmur of heated discussion spilling out. Naomi touched Malcolm's arm. "Remember why we're doing this." Then they stepped inside. 20 faces turned toward them. The air smelled of expensive cologne and stale coffee. At the head of the table, interim CEO Sarah Cho rose to greet them, her crisp navy suit and silver bob projecting calm authority. "Mr. Hayes. Dr. Hayes. Thank you for joining us." Malcolm took the empty seat to her right. Naomi remained standing, placing her tablet on the table with deliberate care. "I've reviewed Atlantic Global's hiring data from the past decade," she began. "The numbers don't lie. Minority applicants are 37% less likely to be promoted to management than their white counterparts with identical qualifications." A balding man in a pinstripe suit, Malcolm recognized him as Kensington's old CFO, leaned forward. "Those statistics are misleading." "No," Naomi cut in. "What's misleading is pretending this company values diversity while maintaining policies that systemically exclude people of color." She tapped her screen, and the wall monitor lit up with graphs. "These are my proposed changes to recruitment, promotion, and pay structures." The room erupted. "You can't just waltz in here and append decades of. This is corporate suicide." Malcolm let the outrage wash over him, watching the reactions around the table. Sarah Cho sat perfectly still, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. The CFO's face had turned an alarming shade of red. Only Marcus, invited as a union representative, remained calm, taking notes in the corner. When the shouting subsided, Malcolm spoke. Atlantic Global lost $87 million last quarter. Your stock price has dropped 22% since the discrimination allegations went public. He leaned forward. You don't have decades. You have 6 months before this company collapses under its own weight. Sarah Cho studied him. What exactly are you proposing? Malcolm smiled. A revolution. The Atlantic Global employee parking lot was nearly empty when Malcolm arrived at dawn the next morning. Frost crunched under his shoes as he crossed the tarmac toward a lone figure standing beside a baggage cart. Marcus blew into his cupped hands, his breath fogging in the cold air. You're crazy, you know that? Nobody meets at 5 a.m. unless someone's dead. Malcolm handed him a steaming coffee. We're alive, aren't we? They walked toward a row of grounded planes, their silhouettes slowly emerging from the darkness as the sky lightened to pale gray. Marcus sipped his coffee, eyeing Malcolm. So what's the real play here? You didn't bring me out here to watch the sunrise. Malcolm stopped beside a Boeing 787, resting his palm against the cold metal. How long have you wanted to be a pilot? Marcus froze mid-sip. What? Don't bullshit me. I've seen your file. You've been taking night classes at the aviation school for 3 years. The older man's shoulders tensed. So what if I have? Company won't sponsor me. Says I'm too old to invest in. His voice dripped with bitterness. Malcolm turned to face him. Starting next month, Atlantic Global is launching an internal pilot training program. No age restrictions. No bullshit quotas. He held out a folded piece of paper. Your application is already approved. Marcus's hands shook slightly as he took the document. In the growing light, Malcolm could see the sheen of moisture in the other man's eyes. Why me? Marcus asked hoarsely. Malcolm looked up at the plane towering over them. Because talent doesn't have an expiration date, and neither does justice. The first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, painting the fuselage in gold. Somewhere in the distance, a bird took flight, its wings beating against the dawn. The Atlantic Global Training Center smelled of new carpet and fresh paint. Malcolm stood in the observation gallery overlooking the main simulator room, watching through soundproof glass as Naomi conducted the first session of the new diversity training program. Below, 20 employees, a mix of flight attendants, baggage handlers, and mid-level managers, sat in a semicircle. Emily Carter was among them, taking diligent notes. Marcus leaned against the back wall, his arms crossed but his expression attentive. Naomi held up a photograph. This is my brother at age 15, being turned away from a job because of how he looked. She tapped the next image. This is him at 36, being denied a first-class meal for the same reason. A murmur ran through the group. The system hasn't changed, Naomi continued. We have to change it. The door behind Malcolm opened, and Sarah Cho joined him at the window. She smelled faintly of jasmine perfume and espresso. Your sister is quite the firebrand, Sarah observed. Malcolm didn't take his eyes off the session. She gets results. Sarah studied his profile. You know they'll fight you every step of the way. The old guard won't give up power without a war. Down below, Naomi had the employees break into small groups. Malcolm watched as Marcus hesitantly joined a conversation with 2 young flight attendants. Let them fight, Malcolm said softly. We've got better weapons. Sarah followed his gaze to where Emily was speaking passionately, her hands moving as she made a point. Hope. Malcolm shook his head. Proof. As if on cue, the large screen at the front of the training room lit up with statistics. Atlantic Global's dismal diversity numbers compared to industry benchmarks. The groans from the participants were audible even through the glass. Sarah sighed. Well, at least the truth doesn't need a budget approval. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the future take shape one uncomfortable conversation at a time. Outside, a plane roared down the runway, its engines shaking the windows as it climbed into the clear blue sky. The Atlantic Global corporate jet touched down at LaGuardia with a gentle bump, the early morning light glinting off the wet tarmac. Malcolm peered through the rain-streaked window as the plane taxied toward the private terminal. He'd spent the red eye from LA reviewing the latest diversity metrics, and the numbers still weren't where they needed to be. Naomi was waiting when he stepped off the plane, her Burberry trench coat flapping in the wind. She handed him a steaming cup of coffee. "You look like death warmed over." Malcolm took a grateful sip. "Feel like it too." They walked toward the waiting town car, the rain letting up just enough to make the morning miserable without being dramatic about it. The scent of jet fuel and wet pavement filled the air. "Board meeting in 2 hours," Naomi said as the car pulled away from the curb. "Cho says they're preparing a counter-proposal to our hiring initiative." Malcolm leaned his head against the cool glass. "Of course they are." The city blurred past outside the window. Warehouses giving way to apartment buildings giving way to the steel and glass canyons of Midtown. Malcolm watched a young black delivery driver struggle with a dolly full of packages, his face set in determined lines against the rain. Naomi followed his gaze. "You can't save everyone, you know." "I'm not trying to save anyone," Malcolm said quietly. "Just level the playing field." The car turned onto Park Avenue, where the Atlantic Global Tower loomed ahead, its upper floors lost in the low clouds. Somewhere in that building, a dozen wealthy white men were preparing to defend their privilege. Malcolm straightened his tie. "Let's go remind them who owns the boardroom now." The Atlantic Global boardroom smelled of wood polish and expensive aftershave. Malcolm took his seat at the head of the table, Naomi to his right, Sarah Cho to his left. Across from them, the old guard sat in stony silence. Kensington's former executives, their tailored suits and polished shoes unable to disguise their resentment. At the far end of the table, Marcus Johnson stood out like a sore thumb in his pilot's uniform, his dark skin and broad shoulders drawing disapproving glances from the older board members. CFO Richard Whitmore cleared his throat. "This is highly irregular. Mr. Johnson isn't a board member." "He's here at my invitation," Malcolm interrupted, "as the first graduate of our new pilot training program." A murmur ran around the table. Whitmore's face flushed. "Be that as it may, we have serious concerns about the direction of these so-called diversity initiatives." Naomi slid a folder across the table. "These are the latest numbers from our LA and Chicago hubs. Employee retention is up 12%. Customer satisfaction scores have never been higher." Whitmore didn't touch the documents. "At what cost? Our training budget has tripled." "And your PR costs have dropped by 40%, Malcolm countered. "Not to mention the lawsuits we're no longer facing." Sarah Cho tapped her pen against the table. "Gentlemen, these initiatives aren't going anywhere. The question is whether you want to be part of the solution or part of the past." The room fell silent. Outside, the rain began again, tapping against the floor-to-ceiling windows like impatient fingers. Marcus cleared his throat. "If I may." All eyes turned to him. Malcolm nodded. Marcus stood, his pilot's wings glinting in the fluorescent light. "I've worked for this company for 15 years. Started loading baggage when I was 22. Never thought I'd be sitting in this room, wearing these wings." He paused, looking around at each face. "But here's the thing, there's a dozen more like me out there. People with talent, with drive. People this company has overlooked for years because they didn't fit some mold." He placed his hat on the table. "You can keep fighting change, or you can be the airline that leads it. But you can't do both." The silence stretched. Malcolm watched the board members exchange glances, their resistance wavering. Finally, Whitmore sighed. "What exactly are you proposing?" Malcolm leaned forward. "A vote. Right here, right now." He met Naomi's eyes, then Marcus's. After everything, the slights, the struggles, the long nights and early mornings, it all came down to this moment. "All in favor?" The Atlantic Global Employee Cafeteria buzzed with conversation as Malcolm walked through the crowded space, balancing a tray of surprisingly decent-looking food. The scent of roasted chicken and fresh bread replaced the old stale coffee smell, and the walls were now adorned with photos of the company's diverse workforce rather than just planes. He spotted Marcus at a corner table, deep in conversation with a group of young mechanics. When they saw Malcolm approaching, the younger men straightened up nervously. "Relax," Marcus said, grinning. "He doesn't bite much." Malcolm set down his tray. "Am I interrupting?" Nah, just telling these kids how you strong-armed the board into approving our apprenticeship program. Marcus winked at the wide-eyed mechanics. Man's got stones, I'll give him that. One of the young men, couldn't have been more than 19, with a fading bruise on his cheekbone, looked at Malcolm with something like awe. Is it true you started out cleaning offices? Malcolm took a bite of mashed potatoes. Worse. I scrubbed toilets at Yankee Stadium. The table erupted in laughter. As the conversation flowed around him, Malcolm studied the young faces. Black, Latino, a young woman with grease under her fingernails and steel in her eyes. The future of Atlantic Global, if he could just give them half a chance. His phone buzzed. A text from Naomi. Cho wants to discuss expanding the training program to corporate. You in? Malcolm typed back one word. Always. As he stood to leave, the young mechanic called after him. Mr. Hayes? Thanks. For, everything. Malcolm nodded, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. This was why he'd fought. Why he'd bought the damn airline in the first place. Don't thank me yet, he said. The real work starts now. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds at last, painting the tarmac in gold. Somewhere beyond the fence, a plane roared into the sky, its wings glinting as it climbed toward the future. The Atlantic Global hangar smelled of jet fuel and fresh paint as Malcolm walked through the cavernous space, his dress shoes clicking against the polished concrete. Overhead, crews worked on a newly acquired 787 Dreamliner, its sleek fuselage bearing the company's redesigned logo, a globe with wings, now rendered in bolder colors that stood out against the white paint. Naomi stood near the nose of the plane, arguing with a technician about something on her tablet. She looked up as Malcolm approached, her expression shifting from frustration to relief. Tell this man we need the new safety placards in Spanish and Mandarin, she said without preamble. The technician, a grizzled veteran with grease stains on his coveralls, shook his head. Regulations only require English. And our customers speak 7 languages, Malcolm interrupted. Make it happen. The man opened his mouth to argue, then thought better of it. He nodded and walked away, muttering into his radio. Naomi exhaled sharply. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Malcolm studied the plane. It's looking good. It's looking expensive. She tapped her tablet, pulling up financials. The board approved the apprenticeship program, but they slashed the training budget by 30%. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Whitmore, Naomi confirmed. He's been whispering in Cho's ear about fiscal responsibility. A loud clang echoed through the hangar as a mechanic dropped a wrench. The sound seemed to hang in the air between them, underscoring Naomi's unspoken question. What now? Malcolm turned away from the plane. Call Marcus. Tell him to prep the Chicago crew. We're doing this the old-fashioned way. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Which is? Malcolm allowed himself a small, grim smile. Showing them the money. O'Hare Airport's Terminal 3 bustled with its usual chaotic energy as Malcolm strode through the crowded concourse, the smell of fast food and cleaning chemicals thick in the air. Travelers rushed past in every direction, dragging suitcases and herding children, their voices rising in a constant hum beneath the announcements blaring from the PA system. Marcus fell into step beside him, his pilot's uniform crisp and professional. They're waiting in conference room B. Brought the numbers you asked for. Malcolm nodded. Any pushback? Some. Marcus's mouth tightened. Regional VP tried to say the diversity hires weren't meeting performance metrics. I showed him the actual metrics. They turned down a quieter hallway, passing framed photos of Atlantic Global's history. All white male executives shaking hands with politicians, cutting ribbons on new planes. Malcolm made a mental note to have them replaced. Conference room B smelled of stale coffee and nervous sweat. 6 mid-level managers sat around a scuffed table, their expressions ranging from wary to openly hostile. At the head of the table, Regional Vice President Daniel Greer, a Kensington holdover with a reputation for playing fast and loose with HR complaints, leaned back in his chair like a king holding court. Mr. Hayes, Greer said, not bothering to stand. To what do we owe the pleasure? Malcolm took the empty seat at the opposite end of the table. I hear you're having performance issues with our new hires. Greer spread his hands. Just calling it like I see it. These diversity candidates require more training, more supervision. Marcus dropped a thick folder on the table with a thud that made Greer flinch. These are the actual performance reviews from your team. Turns out your problem employees are outperforming your favorites by 15%. A murmur ran around the table. Greer's face darkened. Now wait just a minute. No, you wait. Malcolm leaned forward. You've been falsifying reports, sabotaging careers, and costing this company millions in turnover and lost productivity. He tapped the folder. This is your resignation. Effective immediately. Greer's chair screeched as he stood. You can't just. I can, Malcolm said calmly. Because while you were busy playing gatekeeper, I bought the building your office is in. The room went dead silent. Somewhere outside, a plane roared down the runway, the sound vibrating through the walls. Greer opened his mouth, then closed it again. Without another word, he turned and walked out, the door slamming behind him. Malcolm looked around at the remaining managers. Anyone else have concerns about our hiring practices? Not a single hand went up. The Atlantic Global corporate jet climbed through turbulent skies over Lake Michigan, the cabin lights flickering as the plane bounced through clouds. Malcolm stared out the window at the dark water below, his reflection superimposed over the choppy surface. Naomi sat across from him, typing furiously on her laptop. Greer's gone, but his protégés are still embedded throughout the regional offices. Malcolm sipped his bourbon, letting the warmth spread through his chest. We'll root them out. At what cost? Naomi closed her laptop with a snap. We're burning through political capital faster than we're making progress. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, the seatbelt sign pinging on. Malcolm set down his glass. You think I'm going too fast? I think you're making this personal. Naomi met his gaze. Every time someone pushes back, you see Mr. Chong or that flight attendant or every teacher who ever told you you'd amount to nothing. Outside, lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the storm clouds around them. Malcolm didn't respond. Naomi sighed. I'm not saying stop. I'm saying remember why we started this. The pilot came on over the intercom, warning of rough air ahead. Malcolm fastened his seatbelt, watching as Naomi did the same. For the first time in months, he thought about that turkey sandwich on the plane, the way the plastic wrapper had stuck to his fingers, the way the bread had tasted like ash in his mouth. You're right, he said at last. It is personal. The plane shuddered through another patch of turbulence, the wings flexing against the storm. Malcolm closed his eyes, remembering the feel of his mother's hands, rough from cleaning other people's houses, smoothing his hair before his first job interview. You show them, she'd whispered. You show them all. The plane broke through the clouds into clear sky, the sudden sunlight bright enough to make him blink. When he opened his eyes again, Naomi was watching him with something like understanding. All right, she said softly. Then let's make it personal for them too. The Atlantic Global shareholders meeting was held in the grand ballroom of the Chicago Hilton, a space that smelled of expensive perfume and anticipation. Hundreds of suits milled about, their conversations creating a low hum beneath the crystal chandeliers. Reporters clustered near the stage, their cameras trained on the empty podium. Malcolm stood off to one side, adjusting his cufflinks as Naomi finished briefing him. Remember, she whispered, stick to the numbers. The board gets nervous when you talk about justice. Malcolm supplied dryly. Naomi pinched the bridge of her nose. Just don't call anyone a racist to their face, okay? Before Malcolm could respond, Sarah Cho joined them, her silver bob perfectly styled, her navy suit immaculate. They're ready for you. The crowd quieted as Malcolm took the stage, the spotlight warm on his face. He surveyed the sea of expectant expressions, investors hungry for returns, executives nervous about their jobs, reporters looking for a story. 8 months ago, he began, I sat in one of your first-class seats and was told I didn't belong there. A murmur ran through the crowd. Several shareholders exchanged glances. Malcolm clicked to his first slide, a photo of that economy turkey sandwich. This cost Atlantic Global $47 million in contracts. Another click. The screen now showed a graph of their stock price plummeting. This cost you another 22% of your investment. The room was utterly silent now. Malcolm could hear the rustle of fabric as people shifted in their seats. He advanced to the final slide, a photo of Marcus in his pilot's uniform, standing beside a group of diverse new hires. This is what recovery looks like. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to clap. The sound spread, growing louder, until the entire ballroom was on its feet. All except Richard Whitmore and his cronies, who sat stone-faced in the front row. Malcolm met Whitmore's glare and smiled. Meeting adjourned. As he stepped off the stage, Naomi fell into step beside him. That wasn't sticking to the numbers. Malcolm shrugged. I showed them the most important one. Outside, the Chicago skyline glittered in the afternoon sun. Somewhere beyond the hotel walls, a plane took off toward the horizon, its wings gleaming as it climbed into the clear blue sky. The Atlantic Global Training Facility buzzed with an energy that hadn't existed 6 months prior. The scent of fresh coffee mixed with the faint metallic tang of new equipment as Malcolm walked through the halls, nodding to employees who no longer averted their gaze when he passed. The walls were now adorned with photos of the company's diverse workforce: mechanics, pilots, flight attendants, their faces telling a story of quiet revolution. Naomi fell into step beside him, her tablet clutched tightly in one hand. You're late for the orientation. Malcolm checked his watch. They can wait 5 minutes. She grabbed his arm, steering him toward a small break room. The space smelled of microwaved popcorn and stale coffee, a far cry from the executive suites upstairs. Naomi closed the door behind them with a decisive click. You need to see this. She thrust the tablet into his hands. The screen displayed an internal memo from Richard Whitmore to the board of directors. Malcolm scanned the document, his grip tightening with each paragraph. They're trying to kill the apprenticeship program, Naomi said before he could finish, claiming budget constraints, but we both know that's bullshit. Malcolm set the tablet down carefully, his mind already racing through countermoves. When does this go to vote? Next board meeting. 2 weeks. Outside the break room, laughter echoed down the hall. New hires on their lunch break, oblivious to the battle being waged above them. Malcolm watched through the small window as a group of young mechanics joked with each other, their faces alight with the promise of futures they hadn't dared imagine before. We need leverage, he said finally. Naomi crossed her arms. What kind of leverage? Malcolm's phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Found something you need to see. Hangar 3. Now. He pocketed the phone. The kind that leaves scars. Hangar 3 smelled of grease and jet fuel. The cavernous space dominated by a 787 undergoing maintenance. Marcus stood near the left engine, his coverall streaked with oil, his expression grim. Malcolm ducked under a wing strut to join him. What's so urgent? Marcus wordlessly handed him a tablet. The screen showed maintenance logs for the past 6 months. Dozens of entries flagged with red warnings. These are all from Greer's old region, Marcus said quietly. Safety inspections that were signed off but never actually performed. Malcolm scrolled through the documents, his stomach tightening with each page. How deep does this go? All the way to Whitmore. He's been cutting corners for years to boost his bonus metrics. Marcus tapped one particularly damning entry. This plane flew with faulty hydraulics for 3 weeks because some bean counter decided the repair was too expensive. The implications hit Malcolm like a punch to the gut. Hundreds of flights, thousands of passengers, all put at risk so a few executives could pad their bottom line. Naomi's voice came from behind them. This is our leverage. Malcolm turned to see his sister standing in the hangar doorway, her silhouette sharp against the bright sunlight outside. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the concrete. Whitmore's been playing fast and loose with safety to make his numbers look good, she continued. If this gets out, it won't. Malcolm handed the tablet back to Marcus. We're not going to blackmail him. Naomi's eyes widened. Then what? We're going to fix it, Malcolm said simply. Every plane, every inspection, every damn safety protocol they skipped. Marcus shook his head. That'll cost millions. The board will never approve. They will, Malcolm interrupted, when they realize the alternative is criminal negligence charges. A heavy silence fell over the hangar. Somewhere above them, a mechanic's wrench clanged against metal, the sound echoing through the vast space. Naomi was the first to speak. This could bring down the entire company. Malcolm met her gaze. Or save it. Outside, a plane roared down the runway, its engines shaking the hangar doors as it climbed into the sky. The sound seemed to hang in the air between them, a reminder of what was at stake, of the lives that depended on their next move. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag, his jaw set. Where do we start? Malcolm pulled out his phone. By calling Sarah Cho. The Atlantic Global boardroom was tense enough to taste, the air thick with expensive cologne and barely concealed hostility. Malcolm sat at the head of the table, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, watching as Richard Whitmore squirmed in his seat. Sarah Cho stood at the other end of the room, her crisp navy suit a stark contrast to the stormy expressions around her. On the wall screen behind her, damning maintenance records cycled through a slow rotation. "This is blackmail," Whitmore spat, his face flushed. Malcolm didn't blink. "This is accountability." Around the table, board members shifted uncomfortably. The scent of nervous sweat had begun to overpower the room's usual aroma of wood polish and coffee. Naomi stood, placing her palms flat on the table. "We're not here to point fingers. We're here to fix this." She tapped her tablet, and the screen changed to show a proposed safety overhaul budget. Every plane in the fleet needs to be re-inspected. Every maintenance log audited. The numbers on screen made several board members blanch. "That's impossible," Whitmore protested. "The cost is nothing compared to the cost of a single lawsuit when a plane goes down," Malcolm interrupted. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with quiet fury. "And make no mistake, if these safety failures continue, it's not a matter of if, but when." A heavy silence fell. Outside, the distant roar of jet engines underscored the stakes. Sarah Cho cleared her throat. "I move we approve the safety initiative and table all other budget discussions until it's complete." The vote was unanimous. Even Whitmore's reluctant hand eventually rose. As the meeting adjourned, Naomi fell into step beside Malcolm. "That was too close." Malcolm watched Whitmore storm out, his shoulders hunched with defeat. "It's never over." They stepped out onto the executive floor balcony, where the afternoon sun painted the tarmac gold. Below them, crews were already at work on the first plane slated for reinspection. Marcus moved among them, his pilot's wings glinting in the light as he directed the operation. Naomi leaned against the railing. "Remember when this was just about a turkey sandwich?" Malcolm allowed himself a small smile. It was never about the sandwich. A plane taxied toward the runway, its fresh paint gleaming, its passengers blissfully unaware of the battle that had been waged to ensure their safety. As it roared into the sky, Malcolm turned away, not toward the executive suites, but toward the hangars where the real work was being done. The revolution, it seemed, would be maintained. The Atlantic Global Maintenance Bay smelled of fresh paint and hydraulic fluid as Malcolm walked between rows of grounded aircraft. Dawn light filtered through the open hangar doors, painting stripes across the concrete floor where crews worked through the night inspecting planes. His dress shoes clicked against oil-stained concrete, out of place among the steel-toed boots surrounding him. Marcus looked up from a clipboard, dark circles under his eyes. "We're halfway through the fleet. Found 3 more planes that shouldn't have been flying." Malcolm studied the 787 before them, its left engine cowling removed to reveal a cracked compressor blade that glinted dangerously in the work lights. "How bad?" "Bad enough." Marcus wiped grease from his hands. Whitmore's people rubber-stamped inspections without leaving their desks. Saved millions in downtime. Cost who knows how many lives. The scent of burnt metal mixed with the morning air as a technician torqued a bolt nearby. Malcolm watched the sparks fly, thinking of packed cabins cruising at 35,000 feet with these hidden fractures in their wings. Naomi's heels echoed through the hangar as she approached, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. She handed one to Marcus, who accepted it with a grateful nod. "The board is panicking," she said quietly. "Stock's down another 8% this morning after the safety audit leaked to the press." Malcolm sipped his coffee, bitter and black. "Good." A young mechanic, couldn't have been more than 20, with Hernandez stitched on her coveralls, approached hesitantly. "Mr. Hayes? We found something you should see." She led them to a computer terminal where maintenance logs scrolled across the screen. "See these timestamps? The system shows inspections completed at 2:17 a.m. on hangar cameras show the bays empty all night. Marcus cursed under his breath. Naomi's grip tightened around her coffee cup. Malcolm studied the falsified records, then turned to the young mechanic. "How many like this?" Her dark eyes flashed. "Dozens, sir. All signed off by the same supervisors." Outside, the roar of arriving planes shook the hangar doors. Malcolm watched through the opening as another jet touched down, its passengers unaware how close they'd flown to disaster. "Print everything," he told Hernandez. "Then call legal." As she hurried off, Marcus exhaled sharply. "This goes deeper than Whitmore." Malcolm nodded, watching sunlight creep across the oil-stained floor. "Then we dig deeper." The Atlantic Global Corporate Archives smelled of dust and mildew, the narrow aisles crammed with bankers' boxes dating back decades. Malcolm sneezed as he pulled another file, the overhead fluorescents buzzing like angry insects. Naomi sat cross-legged on the floor, her tablet illuminating the sweat on her forehead. Found another pattern. Every time safety budgets got cut, stock bonuses for senior execs went up. Marcus leaned against a shelf, flipping through yellowed maintenance logs. "This shit goes back 20 years. They've been gambling with lives since before some of our mechanics were born." Malcolm wiped dust from a financial report, revealing a familiar name, Richard Whitmore's signature authorizing reduced inspections in 2008. The same year Flight 214 nearly lost an engine over the Atlantic. His phone buzzed, a text from Sarah Cho. *WSJ is asking about the safety audit. What should I tell them? *. Malcolm typed a one-word reply. Truth. As he pocketed his phone, Naomi made a small, triumphant noise. Got it. Whitmore's handwritten note approving cost-saving measures on safety checks. This is the smoking gun. Marcus whistled low. That's prison time. The archive door creaked open, revealing Hernandez still in her grease-stained coveralls. Sorry to interrupt, but... She hesitated, wringing her hands. Some of the guys are scared. If this goes public... Malcolm stood, back protesting from hours on the floor. If this doesn't go public, nothing changes. Hernandez nodded, but her eyes remained troubled. It's just, my uncle was a mechanic here. Died when a fuel line burst during what was supposed to be a routine inspection. She swallowed hard. They told us it was his fault. The words hung in the dusty air between them. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang unanswered. Naomi was the first to move, crossing to Hernandez and squeezing her shoulder. What's your uncle's name? Carlos. Carlos Mendez. Malcolm pulled a fresh folder from the shelf. Then let's find Carlos's records. As dawn light filtered through the small basement windows, four figures worked in silent determination, uncovering lies buried deep enough to crush generations, but not quite deep enough to escape justice. The Atlantic Global press conference room smelled of stale coffee and nervous sweat, packed so tightly Malcolm could feel the heat radiating off the reporters. Camera flashes popped like small explosions as he stepped to the podium, Naomi and Marcus flanking him. Sarah Cho stood off to one side, her usual composure fraying at the edges. Richard Whitmore's chair sat conspicuously empty. Malcolm adjusted the microphone, letting the room's anticipation build. When he finally spoke, his voice carried without amplification. 6 months ago, I was denied a first-class meal because of how I looked. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Today, I'm here to talk about what that meal cost Atlantic Global. He tapped his tablet, and the screens behind him lit up with damning documents. Falsified inspection reports, internal memos prioritizing profits over safety, the handwritten note from Whitmore that made several reporters gasp. These decisions put thousands of lives at risk every day. Malcolm's voice hardened. They cost Carlos Mendez his life. They cost families their loved ones. And they will cost Atlantic Global its future unless we change course today. A reporter in front raised her hand. What about criminal charges? Naomi stepped forward. All evidence has been turned over to the FAA and DOJ. Several executives have already resigned. Marcus added, and we're implementing whistleblower protections so this never happens again. The questions came faster then, a cacophony of shouted demands. Malcolm let them wash over him, watching the reactions. the dawning horror on some faces, the vindication on others. Through the chaos, he caught sight of Hernandez standing in back, tears streaming down her face as she clutched a faded photo of her uncle. When the room finally quieted, Malcolm leaned into the microphone one last time. "This isn't just about fixing planes," he said quietly. "It's about fixing what's broken in all of us that let this happen." Outside, the rumble of departing planes shook the windows, each one now carrying the weight of truth beneath its wings. The Atlantic Global hangar was unusually quiet when Malcolm arrived before dawn. The scent of fresh paint still lingered from the newly stenciled safety warnings on the walls, mixing with the ever-present aroma of jet fuel. A single work light illuminated Marcus hunched over a maintenance log, his pilot's uniform wrinkled from what looked like another all-night shift. "You sleep here now?" Malcolm asked, setting down 2 steaming coffees. Marcus rubbed his eyes before accepting one. "Someone's got to make sure these inspections stick." He tapped the logbook. Third shift caught another one. Faulty oxygen sensors that could have failed at altitude. Malcolm studied the entry, the technical jargon translating to one simple truth: another potential disaster averted. Outside, the first rays of sunlight painted the runway in gold and pink hues. "They're scared," Marcus said quietly. "Mechanics keep coming to me with stuff they found years ago but were too afraid to report." A door slammed somewhere in the hangar, the sound echoing through the cavernous space. Malcolm watched as a young mechanic, early 20s, with Nguyen stitched on her coveralls, approached hesitantly. "Captain Johnson? We found something on the 787. Marcus stood immediately. "Show me." The plane in question loomed in the shadows, its massive engines silent for once. Nguyen led them to the right wing, where a senior mechanic was shining a flashlight into the flap mechanism. "See that?" The older man pointed. "Hydraulic leak. Slow enough to miss unless you're looking for it." Malcolm crouched to see better, the concrete cold beneath his palms. The faint sheen of fluid glistened in the flashlight's beam. "How many flights like this?" The mechanic exchanged glances with Nguyen. "Could have been leaking for weeks. Plane would have kept flying until..." He trailed off with a shrug that said everything. Marcus's jaw tightened. "Ground it." As the mechanic sprang into action, Malcolm's phone buzzed. A text from Naomi. "Feds raided Whitmore's house this morning." He pocketed the phone without responding, watching sunlight creep across the hangar floor. Somewhere overhead, a bird trilled its morning song, oblivious to the lives being saved below. The Atlantic Global boardroom smelled of fresh coffee and nervous energy as Malcolm took his seat at the head of the table. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the new faces around him. Younger, more diverse, several women where before there had been none. Sarah Cho cleared her throat. "First order of business, the DOJ settlement." A murmur ran through the room as documents circulated. Malcolm studied the terms. A record fine, but no criminal charges for the company itself. Whitmore and 3 others faced indictment, but the systemic rot went deeper than a few bad actors. Naomi, seated to Malcolm's right, tapped her pen against the table. "We're complying fully with the investigation, but we need to address morale. Employees are terrified they'll be next." Marcus, newly appointed to the board, leaned forward. "They're not scared of the feds. They're scared of us." The room fell silent. Outside, a plane roared down the runway, the sound vibrating through the glass. Malcolm set down his coffee. "Then we give them reason not to be." He slid a folder across the table, a proposal for amnesty for any employee who came forward with safety concerns, no matter how old. Sarah scanned it quickly. "This could open us up to..." "Better than another plane falling out of the sky," Marcus interrupted. The debate that followed was heated but brief. When the vote came, it was unanimous. As the meeting adjourned, Naomi caught Malcolm's arm. "You realize this makes us vulnerable, right? Every corner cut, every lie told. It'll all come out now." Malcolm watched through the windows as ground crews guided a freshly inspected 787 toward the runway. "That's the point." The plane accelerated down the tarmac, its engine screaming as it lifted gracefully into the clear blue sky. The Atlantic Global employee cafeteria buzzed with conversation, the scent of roasted chicken and fresh bread replacing the old stale coffee smell. Malcolm stood in line with everyone else, tray in hand, nodding to mechanics and flight attendants who no longer lowered their voices when he passed. At a corner table, Hernandez and Gwynn sat with a group of young mechanics, their laughter carrying across the room. Malcolm caught snippets of conversation. Someone's kid had taken first steps, another was celebrating 5 years with the company. Ordinary joys in extraordinary times. He carried his tray to where Marcus sat with several pilots, their uniforms crisp despite the long hours. They made room without being asked. Flight 214's cleared for return to service, Marcus said around a mouthful of sandwich. Full overhaul, new engines, the works. Malcolm remembered that flight, the dry turkey sandwich, the whispered slights, the beginning of everything. Who's captaining? Marcus grinned. Thought I might take her up myself. Full circle and all that. A commotion at the entrance drew their attention. Naomi strode in, her heels clicking against the tile, a newspaper clutched in one hand. She made a beeline for their table. Whitmore pleaded guilty, she said without preamble, dropping the paper in front of Malcolm. The headline blared. Former airline exec admits to safety fraud. Below it, a photo of a handcuffed Whitmore being led into court. Malcolm scanned the article. 10 counts of conspiracy and fraud, up to 20 years in prison. Several others had taken plea deals as well. Marcus let out a low whistle. Damn. Around them, the cafeteria had gone quiet, employees straining to hear. Naomi turned and raised her voice. Justice Department just confirmed convictions in the safety cover-up. Whitmore's going away. The eruption was instantaneous. Cheers, applause, someone actually whooping. A flight attendant burst into tears while the man beside her hugged her tightly. Malcolm watched it all unfold, the newspaper still in his hands. This wasn't victory. Not yet. There were still planes to inspect, policies to change, trust to rebuild. But it was a start. Outside, the sun shone brightly on the tarmac where planes came and went with clockwork precision, each one now carrying not just passengers, but the weight of hard-won redemption beneath its wings. The Atlantic Global corporate jet touched down at LaGuardia with a gentle bump, the setting sun painting the tarmac in shades of amber and gold. Malcolm unbuckled his seatbelt as the plane taxied toward the private terminal, the week's exhaustion settling deep in his bones. The faint scent of lemon disinfectant lingered in the cabin, mixing with the familiar aroma of jet fuel that seeped through the air vents. His phone buzzed, a text from Naomi. Asterisk meeting in 30. Cho's office. Asterisk. Malcolm sighed and typed a quick reply. The meeting would be another debate about cost overruns from the safety overhaul. 3 months since Whitmore's conviction, and the board was growing restless about profits. As he stepped off the plane, the humid New York air wrapped around him like a damp towel. His driver stood waiting by the town car, but Malcolm waved him off. I'll walk. The terminal bustled with its usual chaotic energy. Business travelers rushing to make connections, families herding children toward baggage claim. Malcolm moved through the crowd unnoticed. Just another suit in a sea of suits. Near the security line, a familiar voice caught his attention. Complete disaster from start to finish. Malcolm turned to see Daniel Roth, his former seatmate from that fateful flight, holding court with 2 associates near a Starbucks. Roth's salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his Brioni suit probably costing more than most people's monthly rent. The food alone was atrocious, Roth continued, oblivious to Malcolm's presence. I'll be flying Emirates from now on. One of his companions chuckled. Not a fan of the new diversity hires playing pilot, eh? Roth smirked. Let's just say I prefer my captains to have graduated from actual flight schools, not affirmative action programs. Malcolm's hands curled into fists at his sides. He took a step forward. Mr. Hayes. A gentle touch on his arm. Malcolm turned to find a young black woman in an Atlantic Global uniform standing beside him, her dark eyes wide with recognition. I just wanted to say thank you, she said softly. The apprentice program changed my life. Some of the tension left Malcolm's shoulders. What's your name? Talia. Talia Johnson. I start first officer training next month. She glanced past him to where Roth was still holding forth. Don't let them get to you, sir. They're dinosaurs. Malcolm exhaled sharply. Dinosaurs caused mass extinctions. Talia grinned. Exactly. And look what came after. Somewhere overhead, the PA system announced a departing flight. Malcolm gave Talia's shoulder a squeeze. You're going to make an excellent captain." As he walked away, Roth's laughter followed him, a fading echo of a world that was already disappearing. One plane, one promotion, one brave young woman at a time. The Atlantic Global headquarters lobby smelled of fresh flowers and polished marble. The evening cleaning crew already at work as Malcolm arrived. The security guard, a burly man with Williams on his badge, nodded respectfully. "Evening, Mr. Hayes. Dr. Hayes is waiting upstairs." The elevator ride to the executive floor was silent but for the soft hum of machinery. Malcolm straightened his tie, preparing for another battle with the board over budgets and bottom lines. Sarah Cho's office door stood slightly ajar, the scent of jasmine tea and expensive perfume drifting into the hallway. Inside, Naomi and Sarah sat facing each other across a coffee table strewn with financial reports. Malcolm knocked lightly on the doorframe. "You wanted to see me?" Sarah looked up, her silver bob catching the light. "Close the door." The tension in the room was palpable. Naomi's jaw was set in that particular way that meant she'd been arguing. Sarah's usually impeccable posture showed the slightest slump of exhaustion. Malcolm took the empty seat between them. "What's happened?" Sarah slid a document across the table. A buyout offer from a rival airline. The numbers were staggering. "They're offering nearly double our current valuation," Sarah said quietly. Naomi's fingers tapped an angry rhythm against her knee. "Because they want to scrap everything we've built. Lay off thousands. Go back to business as usual." Malcolm studied the offer, the zeros blurring together. This wasn't just about money. It was a referendum on everything they'd fought for. Sarah poured tea with steady hands. "The board is leaning toward accepting." Outside, the city lights twinkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Somewhere below, planes took off and landed in carefully orchestrated harmony. Malcolm set the document down. "Call an emergency shareholder meeting." Naomi's head snapped up. "You can't be serious." "I'm dead serious." Malcolm met Sarah's gaze. "Let's put it to a vote. All of it, the safety reforms, the apprentice programs, the future of this company." The silence stretched. A plane roared past the window, its wing lights blinking red in the gathering dark. Sarah set down her teacup with a decisive click. "I'll make the calls." As Malcolm stood to leave, Naomi caught his arm. Her fingers were ice cold. "What if we lose?" He thought of Talia Johnson's bright eyes, of Marcus's proud shoulders in his captain's uniform, of Hernandez's tears when the truth about her uncle finally came out. Then at least we made them say it out loud. The Atlantic Global shareholder meeting was standing room only. The ballroom at the Marriott Marquis packed with investors, employees, and reporters. The air smelled of expensive perfume and nervous sweat, the hum of conversation rising toward the crystal chandeliers. Malcolm stood at the podium, Naomi and Marcus flanking him, Sarah Cho seated just behind. The buyout offer sat on the table between them like a live grenade with the pin pulled. Camera flashes popped as Malcolm adjusted the microphone. He didn't need notes. Every word of this speech was etched into his bones. 8 months ago, he began, this company nearly killed me. A ripple of surprise ran through the crowd. Even Naomi shot him a questioning look. Malcolm tapped his tablet, and the screens behind him lit up with an image of that infamous turkey sandwich. Not with faulty planes or bad maintenance, though we fixed those problems. Another tap, and the sandwich was replaced with a photo of Flight 214's passenger manifest. They nearly killed me by making me believe, just for a moment, that I didn't belong in that first-class seat. The room was utterly silent now. Malcolm advanced to the next slide, a split image of Marcus in his old baggage handler uniform and his new captain's attire. This company spent decades telling people like Marcus Johnson they weren't good enough, telling women like my sister they didn't belong in the boardroom, telling mechanics like Carlos Mendez their lives were expendable. He clicked to the buyout offer, the numbers glowing red behind him. Now someone wants to pay us billions to go back to that world, to undo every hard-won change. A murmur ran through the crowd. Several shareholders shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Naomi stepped forward. The choice is simple. Take the money and betray every employee who trusted us. Or stay the course and build something that actually works, for everyone. Marcus moved to the other side of the podium, his captain's wings glinting under the lights. I've spent 20 years at Atlantic Global. Never thought I'd wear these. He touched the wings lightly. Now there's a dozen more like me coming up through the ranks. You sell us out now, you're not just killing a company, you're killing dreams. The silence that followed was deafening. Malcolm could hear the rustle of fabric as people shifted, the soft click of camera shutters, the distant hum of the hotel's HVAC system. Then, from the back of the room, a single pair of hands began to clap. Malcolm squinted against the lights. It was Talia Johnson, still in her apprentice uniform, her face alight with fierce pride. The applause spread, building like a wave until the entire ballroom was on its feet. Investors, employees, even a few reporters. Only a handful of older shareholders remained seated, their expressions stormy. Sarah Cho stepped to the microphone, her voice cutting through the noise. The board withdraws its recommendation to accept the buyout offer. The eruption was instantaneous. Cheers, shouts, someone actually sobbing with relief. Malcolm caught Naomi's eye as the crowd surged forward, reporters shouting questions, employees reaching out to shake their hands. Amid the chaos, Marcus leaned close. "This ain't over, you know." Malcolm watched as Talia was lifted onto the shoulders of her fellow apprentices, their cheers ringing to the rafters. "Not by a long shot," he agreed. Outside, through the ballroom windows, the city lights glittered like stars, and somewhere beyond them, planes crisscrossed the night sky, each one carrying the weight of promises kept and futures changed, their navigation lights blinking red and green against the dark. The Atlantic Global hangar smelled of fresh paint and new upholstery as Malcolm walked through the cavernous space. Morning light streamed through the open doors, illuminating rows of planes undergoing final inspections before returning to service. The scent of coffee and breakfast burritos mingled with the ever-present tang of jet fuel as mechanics took their morning breaks. Marcus stood near a freshly refurbished 787, his captain's uniform crisp in the morning light. He grinned as Malcolm approached. Flight 214's ready for her maiden voyage. New engines, new interior, even fixed that sticky lavatory door in first class. Malcolm ran a hand along the plane's smooth fuselage. "Who's flying her?" "Thought I would," Marcus said, straightening his shoulders. "With Talia as first officer. Kid earned her wings faster than anyone in company history." A familiar voice called from across the hangar. "Don't let that go to your head, Johnson." Talia strode toward them, her dark curls pulled back in a neat bun, her first officer's uniform looking like it had been tailored just for her. The gold stripes on her shoulders gleamed in the sunlight. Malcolm shook her hand. "Nervous?" Talia's grin was infectious. "About flying with this old man? Please. I've been running circles around him in the simulators for weeks." Marcus rolled his eyes but couldn't hide his pride. "Come on, hotshot. Pre-flight checks won't do themselves." As they walked toward the plane, Naomi appeared at Malcolm's side, her tablet clutched tightly. Board still grumbling about the buyout, but the numbers don't lie. Customer satisfaction is through the roof, and we're beating projections for the first time in years. Malcolm watched as Marcus and Talia began their inspection, moving in perfect sync around the massive aircraft. "Where's Sarah?" "Finalizing the Carlos Mendez safety initiative with the FAA." Naomi's voice softened. "Hernandez is flying in for the ceremony." The hangar PA system crackled to life. Asterisk, Flight 214 now boarding at Gate B12. All passengers please proceed to the gate. Asterisk. The familiar announcement sent a chill down Malcolm's spine. The same flight number. The same gate. A completely different world. Gate B12 buzzed with activity as Malcolm approached. The space had been completely remodeled. Brighter lighting, more seating, even a small exhibit honoring Carlos Mendez and other employees lost to safety failures. The scent of fresh coffee from the new concession stand mixed with the faint floral notes of the living wall installation. Passengers milled about, their voices creating a pleasant hum beneath the occasional PA announcement. Malcolm spotted a young black couple in first-class seats, the woman bouncing a giggling toddler on her knee while her partner reviewed documents. Nearby, an elderly Asian man chatted animatedly with a white flight attendant who listened with genuine interest. Emily Carter, now head of in-flight services, stood near the jet bridge, her uniform bearing the new diversity pin every employee wore. She smiled as Malcolm approached. "Full flight today," she said, handing him a boarding pass. "Including some special guests." Malcolm studied the manifest. Marcus as captain, Talia as first officer, Hernandez in 12A, Naomi in 3B, and his own seat, 3A, the same position he'd occupied that day. Emily's expression turned serious. "You sure about this?" Malcolm pocketed the boarding pass. Closure doesn't happen by accident. The gate agent announced final boarding, and passengers began filing onto the jet bridge. Malcolm hung back, watching as Hernandez paused before the memorial plaque bearing her uncle's name, her fingers brushing the engraved letters before squaring her shoulders and boarding the plane. When it was his turn, Malcolm stepped onto the jet bridge, the familiar scent of conditioned air filling his nostrils. Somewhere ahead, a baby laughed, the sound echoing off the narrow walls. One deep breath, then another, and then Malcolm Hayes walked onto Flight 214, not as a victim, not as an avenger, but simply as a passenger beginning a long overdue journey home. The first-class cabin of Flight 214 hummed with quiet contentment as the plane cruised at 35,000 feet. The scent of freshly prepared meals, filet mignon for everyone this time, wafted through the cabin as flight attendants moved efficiently down the aisle. Malcolm sat in 3A, watching sunlight glint off the wing outside his window. Across the aisle, Naomi tapped away on her laptop, already drafting proposals for next quarter's initiatives. A soft chime preceded Marcus's voice over the PA. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently cruising over the Midwest with clear skies all the way to LA. On behalf of First Officer Johnson and the entire crew, thank you for choosing Atlantic Global." The pride in his voice was unmistakable. Hernandez leaned across the aisle from 12A, holding up her phone to show Malcolm a photo. A young boy in a miniature pilot's uniform, grinning ear to ear. "My son wants to be just like Captain Johnson when he grows up." Malcolm smiled. "He will." The flight attendant, a young man with Nguyen on his name tag, arrived with Malcolm's meal. Not a plastic-wrapped sandwich, but actual china, real silverware, and a glass of Cabernet that probably cost more than his first paycheck. As Malcolm took his first bite, the plane hit a small patch of turbulence, just enough to make the wine slosh gently in its glass. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly in all directions. No limits, no boundaries, just the vast open space of what might yet be. Somewhere up front, Talia's laughter echoed from the cockpit. And for the first time in a very long time, everything felt exactly as it should be.